Okay.
Excuse me, Pastor Corey.
Yes.
With the streaming and the video, will it show our video or just your video?
Yeah, well, it will show when I'm not displaying my screen, it can show yours. And if you don't want that to happen, you can turn your video off.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Okay, I'm just trying to pull up my screen here. All right, so we're starting something new tonight. That's kind of something that was put out by American Baptist Home Mission Societies. And one of the names that you see there, well, if you can see it, is Ron Carlson, and he was my missional church professor for my doctoral work at Central. And well, we'll get into this, but we're going to do this over a number of weeks. I have no idea how many. It just depends on how we use the curriculum and how quickly we get through it. The curriculum itself is 5 units with at least 4 weeks in each unit, and we're not going to do it that long. As a matter of fact, I'm getting us through a majority of Unit 1 in those 5 weeks tonight, I think, but a little more than tonight probably. So the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what this series kind of gets at is that they have to be read through the lens of mission, God's mission in the world. And they're read in other ways. The Gospels can be read as biographies of Jesus, which they kind of are, or explanations of how to be saved and how Jesus did that and all of that, and they're that too. But they were written very much from the perspective of mission. It's kind of the perspective here. And so hopefully this is, I know many of you have studied the Gospels throughout your life and being a part of church, I would assume, but maybe this will end up being a new way to look at it. And what I'm doing this week and next week, at least, I think, is a kind of a prequel, what the unit calls mission before the Gospels. So we're going to kind of set some things up and then do each of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But to start, when we say that it has to be, that the Gospels have to be read through the lens of mission, let's take a step back and look at that word, mission. And I like to start with big, broad questions that require about 10 minutes to think, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Mission, it's a word that we use in church all the time and that other people use in other contexts. But to mean what? When you think about Jesus, Christianity, and what we talk about as mission, and of course our church has a mission board, right? We have a whole board for it. What is mission? What do you think of when you hear that word?
I think of the hands and feet of Christ, being the hands and feet.
Okay, and in particular, what does that entail for you?
Means going out, whether it's locally or internationally or nationally, and serving and sharing who he is in your life, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Practical serving needs, meeting needs.
Okay. Going, serving, meeting needs. All right.
I think the prophets Amos and Isaiah had something to say about that. What is worship? It's meeting the needs of people, not offering empty sacrifices.
They did indeed. What was that, Darlene?
Teaching. Could mean teaching.
Okay, some teaching involved.
Sometimes it also involves listening. I'm sitting on the porch, just listening,
Okay.
being there, you know, and listening what their needs are and so forth.
It doesn't show it. So if I get off this.
The first thing that came to my mind is the Great Commission. You know, go into all the world, make disciples.
Mm-hmm.
I sort of, like to think of it instead of the board of missions, the board of love.
Okay.
Love your neighbor, love God.
Okay. The other three boards, we don't do that love stuff, but the mission board. No, I'm just kidding. I also see in the in the chat, Jenna has said action, guided and called for by the Spirit, as how to think about mission. Thank you, Jenna. How many of you are Baptist enough to tell me what the old Baptist mission societies did?
Yeah, the women met and rolled bandages.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, for eons we've done that.
Yeah. There were several mission societies made for women. Several early on, actually. Yeah.
Going back a lot further, they were reaching out to evangelize the what were then called the wild Indians, who were not actually regarded as human beings by a lot of people.
Yeah, to better convert the heathen, right? Kathy,
Right.
you're muted if you're speaking there. I had to mute you for background noise.
They also had a history when the trains came into being. So I can't tell what years those were, but they bought what they called chapel cars and went west with and did church meetings in the chapel cars, stopping in different towns along the trainway going out west. So that was certainly a mission to not necessarily to the Indians, but to the people that were living in the beginnings of towns across the country into the West.
Yep. Yep. Kind of expansion of the church. There was some church planting involved with the mission societies. One summary is, you had all these, especially with Baptists, you had all these individual churches, right? Because that's how Baptists operated, is local church autonomy. And you had all these individual Baptist churches, and they said, you know what, we might be able to do more and fund more and go more and get some more people together if we pull some resources and create something bigger than ourselves. And so some of these mission societies were founded. Now, you might remember that one of our denominational entities still has that in its name, but only after kind of rebranding to the past identity. Those of you who are really close to denominational stuff will remember it wasn't too long ago that they were called National Ministries. And then I think it was under the leadership of the current executive director, Jeffrey Hagray, that they said, we want to rebrand to our old historic identity as American Baptist Home Mission Societies and get the word mission back in there. And it still kind of has a number of societies under that umbrella, a publishing house. Oh, I meant to mention that. It was also some of it was based around the publication of tracts, gospel tracts that you could hand out and say, here's the gospel, here's how you get saved. And they published those. And now it's today it's the American Baptist Publishing House is Judson Press, and they don't do, their focus is not tracts anymore, but they publish books and Christian authors, and some that we've used in Calvary. That's a link, by the way, if you want kind of a really quick history of American Baptist Home Mission Societies, it's on their website at that link that I put there. But because I know that you're always chomping at the bit for the pastor's custom definition, if I had to if I had to define the word, I actually like a lot of what you said. As I tried to encapsulate it, I came up with the phrase announcing, bringing, planting, and practicing the love of God. That's mission. So that you can do that in a whole host of ways, right? But announcing, bringing, planting, and practicing the love of God. But let me give you what other people have said. One of the seminal works on missiology, which is actually a thing, is from David Bosch, and he says that the reign of God, or the kingdom of God is another word for that, is reconciliation, peace, and new life, and says the church is to display to humanity a glimmer of God's imminent reign. And he's alluding there to something Jesus says at the beginning of his ministry. He goes around saying, repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand, right? And when he says that, he doesn't mean you're about to die and go to heaven. He says that God is doing something new among you. And the Greek phrase basileon tou theou, I think it is, means kingdom or reign of God. And it's not a place, it is the state of things when God's ways are in control. Then there's this phrase that you read about. This is all set up prequel stuff, by the way, but missio Dei, it's time for Latin. Missio Dei simply means the mission of God. And this refers to the way people started to talk early in the 20th century about mission, and saying that the mission doesn't belong to the church, it belongs to God. God, the primary mission mover is God, God's self. Archbishop Rowan Williams, I've shared this in worship before. It's one of my favorite quotes. It is not the church of God that has a mission, it's the God of mission that has a church. I really, I don't know how many people make something of that distinction, but that's a super important distinction to me. As Calvary Baptist, we don't have our own mission. The God of mission has us to accomplish God's mission and purposes. Just to give you a little bit of history for those of you who like this kind of thing, Karl Barth, a theologian who lived from 1886 to 1968, was one of the first theologians to articulate mission as being first and foremost an activity of God. Almost as a correction to the things that had happened over centuries and centuries of the church, who kind of saw it as all about their duty, their processes, their converts, and all of this. And then the actual term missio Dei seems to have first been used by Karl Hartenstein in 1934 in response to Barth, and he would later use the phrase to summarize the theme at a conference, an International Missionary Council. So the mission is God's, and the church simply participates. But what is God's mission? I asked you what mission is in general, what you think of that. We say it's God's mission. What is God's mission? Well, as Christians, we believe it was most fully revealed in Jesus. And he kind of gave a primer on his own mission when he was in the temple reading from the scroll of Isaiah. He quoted it, and he said, the Spirit of the Lord is on me because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight to the blind, set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And he said, after that, this is being fulfilled in your hearing. And so both in that moment and just in what Jesus did as the incarnation of God, the fullest and most complete, we believe, he showed what God's mission is. And so then we start talking about the Gospels that talk about Jesus's life. And you may have seen in my notes, I think they wrote this Bible study as kind of inspired by this book, Mission in the Gospels, by R. Jeffrey Harris. He says the Gospels reflect the fact that mission is the essence of the church's life. The life of Jesus is invariably represented as being enacted in the world at large, and not in religious settings exclusively, he means, among ordinary people of all sorts, and not just among believers, reaching out to those beyond the normal scope and influence of the religious establishment. So in other words, if we acknowledge that the mission is God's and the church is simply God's tool for mission, God is in no way limited to using the church. God is in no way limited by the institutional church if we get too distracted by other things. God will accomplish his mission. I also like in thinking about the difference in how we see Jesus and what God was about. The late Rachel Held Evans, one of my favorite quotes from her. We have created a culture in which Christians tend to see Jesus as a sort of static mechanism by which salvation is secured, rather than the full embodiment of God's will for the world, whose life and teachings we are called to emulate and follow. I'm gonna stop there and see if there's anything you make of that quote. The distinction she makes, she says, Christians tend to see Jesus as a static mechanism by which salvation is secured. And she says, instead, we need to see him as the full embodiment of God's will for the world and emulate and follow that. Does that distinction connect with you at all? And if so, what do you hear in it?
Well, it gets back to faith and works. The idea being that salvation is secured by faith in the potential for Jesus saving us, but that we are expected to act out service to Jesus as a ministry of praise.
Okay. Book of James especially talks about that.
And it says to me too that salvation isn't something that we just get to and have achieved. It's okay, now we're good. It's a going forward with that. Because we are saved, we are expected to go forward and spread the news and to live out what we believe and what we know and to serve. And it's a going forward process. So it doesn't just end when you go, oh, good, I'm saved, because I believe this. It's a part of a journey that we are on from that. Kind of a giving back, maybe even for paying it forward for our salvation, knowing we are saved, to feel that it doesn't end there, that we now are expected to give.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Melanie. Yeah, is that a raised hand, Jenna?
Yeah, it is.
I like that feature. Yeah.
Something that really stands out here for me is about embodiment of God's will. And for me, this is really important because I think that we receive the messages about what to do in the world. What is God's will in the world? Like what is his will for us to do personally? You receive those messages in the body. And so I think that really steps out for me in this.
Yeah, embodiment, making it real, giving it hands and feet, like Melanie was saying, right? All right, thank you all for that. So we'll continue on. Let's see how far we get. I'll just stop when we're out of time. But unit 1 in this thing is mission before the Gospels. So before we get to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which we're going to do separately with these lenses on, let's do a little pre stuff here. In a couple of places, obviously when I use curriculum, I kind of adapt it and throw in some other things. But along the way, I'll be giving you a few passages from the curriculum itself. And this is one of them. Ron Carlson and the other guy, Sam Brink, They say before Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John wrote their gospels, before the apostles ventured on missionary journeys across Judea, Samaria, Europe, and beyond, before they wrote any letters to the early churches, in fact, before any accounts of the life and teachings of Jesus were put into writing, these stories, sayings, and accounts were passed on from Jerusalem all the way to Rome. For those of you who struggle with geography, that's not close. That's a long way. Okay. It's amazing that in an age before telecommunications, without computer networks, phones, or any of the writings that make up the New Testament text, these things were true. Jews and Gentiles of many cultures became ardent followers of Jesus before a word was written down, right? Churches were started, Christian leaders were trained, and newly forming faith communities began embarking on a mission with God, a journey that brought them on a mission in their own communities and beyond. So I think I really like this quote that one of those things I've remembered ever since I was in my master's program from one of my professors. He said, the church gave us the Bible, not the other way around. And that's what they're pointing out here. Chronologically, the church came first. And the Bible was written later. Everything that we have and what we know as the New Testament, all of that was written after lots of churches were planted and established and lots of new Christians made. By the time the earliest gospel, which is most likely Mark, was written, the church had already existed for decades, and Christianity had spread through Asia Minor and beyond. And just, you know, in terms of date of writing, some of Paul's letters and not the Gospels are the earliest New Testament books. Now, we have received it in the form that it is because it kind of makes sense to start with the books of the Bible that actually tell the story of Jesus, you know, before then getting on to the people who wrote, you know, about Jesus later and the later development of the church after he lived. But in terms of when it was written, it all kind of goes the other way. It was oral storytelling first, much like it was with the Old Testament, just over a much longer period of time. And churches already existed even before Paul's earliest letter, which in case you're wondering, we think is 1 Thessalonians in terms of which was written earliest and first. So there had to be mission. There had to be this hands and feet. There had to be this going, this action, this embodiment, all the stuff that you guys have been talking about and pointing out, because the church gave us the Bible, not the other way around. It's not like Jesus happened and they sat down and wrote it all, and then they took this newly formed Bible to the churches, and then the churches formed. It happened the other way. That we had all kinds of churches everywhere before we had a New Testament. What do you make of that? Do you normally think of it that way? Does it change anything in how you view the early church in the Bible? Am I telling you things you already know?
Well, in modern times, though, when I'm saying modern times, that settling in the United States, probably people did go around with a Bible first and said, here's this word of God. Now let's build a church. I mean, you could figure that was a must be in their carrying around to places.
Right, because we had it then.
Right.
Yeah.
However, there's also been a lot of missions to people whose languages have not yet been reduced to writing.
Yes.
And of course, it's always good to remember what the literacy levels were in ancient times, not what they are today. It was not common for people to be able to read and write at a large scale level.
But you did have the scriptures, the Old Testament.
You did have that.
You know, the Hebrew scriptures And that's, certainly a big foundation of the church. So you did have that. But again, what you just said, an awful lot of it was, just even like in Hebrew times, oral passing on of the stories. I mean, that was their Facebook. That was their social media.
Yeah, well, and what you point out there, Tom, is correct. That perhaps the more accurate version of the quote is the church gave us the New Testament, not the other way around, because obviously they had what we know as the Old Testament. Of course, it was not in bound, put together format. It was on individual scrolls. But, so they had that, but, everywhere Jewish believers in Jesus went, because remember, the first believers were Jewish, as was Jesus. They would have to go and, they had this Old Testament and this Jewish tradition in common, but then the very next thing would be, well, what are you talking about? Jesus? What? And they didn't, nothing was written down yet in terms of new scriptures about him or letters or anything like that. And so it was their witness, their storytelling. That's all they had. Sit down on the rocking chair and it's story time. Let me tell you about this guy.
And when Paul went out to the non-Jews, he wasn't taking the Old Testament and saying, start here.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that became a bone of contention, because some of the Jewish Christians were saying, yes, you need to start here. You need to do all these things first.
Yeah, exactly. And as I've pointed out, when we talk about some of Paul's letters, I mean, some of them sound like kind of a teaching to the church, and we can read it today, and it sounds like he might be talking to us as well. But some of those letters from Paul, it sounds like you just opened somebody else's mail, right? Like Philemon, I mean, he wrote that to a particular person to say, please take this runaway slave back and don't punish him and treat him as a brother now, and things like that are also included in it. It's very interesting. Another thing from the curriculum, the power of storytelling is what I'm getting at here. That's what had to happen first. And so it must have tremendous power, because the stories about Jesus spread pretty far and wide before there was ever anything that we think of as a New Testament. Never underestimate the power of the spoken word. Why is this night different from all other nights? You can read it on the screen. What celebration do you always start that question with? The Seder meal, right? I don't think I've been around for one. You guys have done those at Calvary, right?
Yes.
Seder meal reenactments. And of course, it's a Jewish tradition, but it goes back to the Passover, and the Passover is what Jesus was celebrating with his disciples that we now call the Last Supper. And so why is this night different from all other nights? You start the Seder meal with that. The question is asked by the youngest Jewish child at the table or whatever. And what follows that question is a retelling of the Passover story. The phone was handed off to Richard. Did you want to say something, or are you just on screen now, Richard?
No, I'm just on screen. She disappeared.
Okay, I'm just making sure. Or they also point out from Sue Monk Kidd in her book, The Secret Life of Bees, which I have not read, by the way. Stories have to be told or they die. We can't remember who we are or why we're here. I like that. So a little bit of discussion here. And instead of just one question, I'm going to take all 5 questions that they put out there. The group tonight is not quite big enough to go into breakout rooms, so we'll just all stay here. But these 5 questions, just grab, one of these questions that sparks something in you and speak to it if you would like. But the power of storytelling. So ask yourself, what role did oral communication play in your family of origin? Was there a storyteller in your family? What were some of your family stories? And be careful, we're live on Facebook. If you were to give each story a title, what would those titles be? Share a story that taught you about your family history. Recall a story that helped shape your sense of family values. What value did your story reinforce? It's an interesting question. Or tell a story that helped shape your personal identity. So you, your family, your life, your identity. Tell me about the role that storytelling has played. And as you think, I just want to share the image of, I don't know how many of you, probably not many of you have seen the picture, but when I was working with Sam Dallas' family in preparation for his funeral, they showed me a whole bunch of pictures, and there's one picture that just for some reason I'm not going to forget. It's a picture of Sam sitting there in his recliner, and he's got 2 or 3 grandkids or great grandkids sitting there on the other recliner, you know, just like this, like head in their hands, listening intently to Sam's stories, because he just had some way, and you guys know this, Sam had some kind of way of telling stories and loved to tell stories. And I think when we lost Sam, we lost one of Calvary's great storytellers. Now you might hear it more than once, but Sam had some stories to share, and that's one of the images that I think of with the storyteller in the family. But now I'll be quiet and let you answer.
I had a grandfather who was born in 1865 while Sherman was marching past, scooping up everything on his way. And he had a lot to say about the Yankees, and none of it positive. I remember at about the age of 7 or 8, I first heard the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and I thought it was a wonderful song, and I was humming it to my grandfather, and he washed my mouth out with Lysol.
Oh my. Okay. Thank you, Jim.
I was thinking when you marry into another family, you inherit their stories. And you learn their stories, and every Thanksgiving you have to go through all of those turkey stories, which I won't tell right now, but there were several that had to be told at the Thanksgiving table year after year after year.
Yep. How many of you who've raised children had a book that you had to read again and again and again when they were young?
Well, even Sunday, as worship leader, I told that story of our walk on Market Street at Christmas in Philadelphia. And, you know, I've told that story a number of times at Calvary. And, you know, that's shaped my identity to this day.
Okay, yeah.
I heard the stories of Granny Greer, who was 101 and did weaving on a loom that was dated in 1901, and her picture hung in the Smithsonian Institute, and how her grandson carried on the weaving. And I actually met him. I never met Granny. But I've gone and watched my Taft weaving on this old loom.
Wow.
The Appalachian Mountain crafts kind of thing. He used to take the loom, or he didn't take the loom. He would go to Washington, D.C. Cherry Festival and weave on an old loom to share the craft of weaving.
Oh, fascinating.
I have what I remember of stories my grandmother told me about leaving Latvia and crossing the Atlantic and seeing the icebergs and and coming to the United States and trying to practice her English by reading signs and so forth. And that she always told about seeing the sign for Issy cream because she didn't know how to pronounce it.
Go back to the full Zoom so we can see each other. Just that you will be visible on the live stream if you mind that. Turn your video off. Any others?
I'm laughing because we didn't really have so much storytelling as complaint retelling. So there's that. But the stories or the memories that I remember hearing repeatedly actually had to do with the ones that like really stand out is about their first marriages, being married when they were like 16, and then leaving the first husband on both sides. So the tribulations with both, and about working and like maybe lying about their age so that they could be eligible to work. They were 14, but they said they were 16. So a lot of, how like economic survival stories.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. The gripes and complaints get told like stories too, don't they? I will just say I also remember, growing up in church, I was one of the ones who, whenever they said that a missionary was going to visit the church, and a foreign missionary was going to visit the church and show pictures and tell stories, that we all kind of got excited about that, because the stories that missionaries told were always just seemed so different than what we experience, and we just loved hearing, and I wouldn't have said this at the time, but it's almost as if we're back home in our pattern of home and school and church, and we hear the stories of Jesus and the things we're supposed to do, but then some foreign missionary comes and puts this whole new skin on it. And it's almost like we're hungry for, tell me how this looks, tell me how this works. How did you, the story of Jesus and this gospel, when you went to wherever in the world, what did you do with it? It's almost as if we were hungry for that kind of thing. I always liked it anyway. So I think we got time for a little activity that they suggest in here. Do you guys have paper? Have paper and pencil nearby? You don't have to, obviously, but if you do, we're going to do something that uses that. So what you're going to do on the two pieces of paper is what you're going to need. On the first one, you're just going to jot down things from your story. Now, you don't have to like sit there and write these stories. All you're going to need for your purposes is like a word or a phrase or a picture that easily brings to mind these things. But think of both positive and negative, the major story turns in your life, the major page turns, you might say. If you read the Choose Your Own Adventure book, just when you go to this page or that page, the major story turns in your life. And if you need help thinking about what these were, like, and if I were to put a number on it, like 10 to 15, but not necessarily that within there, but your major story turns. If you need some prodding questions to jog things in you, you can ask what 3 or 4 people have had the greatest impact on your life and why. What do you consider to be your greatest accomplishment? What was the saddest day of your life? Remember, this is positive and negative, major story turns. What were the educational milestones or disappointments in your life? What was your first real job? I read that and found myself asking, is making Arby's sandwiches a real job? Because that was the first thing I got paid to do. What are your most significant relationship memories, which are also very much can be positive or negative, right? Birthdays, holidays, first love, wedding, divorce, deaths. How would you finish the statements? This is going off the page a little bit. Whoops. All right, let me go back. How would you finish the statements? I thought I had it made when, or I knew my life was over when. Now, these are just prodding and jogging questions, not, answer these 7, but just to come up with kind of a list through pictures or words or whatever of your life's major story turns, positive and negative. And so you can think about the more common things like graduation, marriage, death of a loved one, things like that. But also sometimes the major story turns in your life are the less common things and things that didn't necessarily happen to a large percentage of the population. I'll leave these prompts up for you and give you a few more minutes. So then step 2 on the other piece of paper, when you have some things, and I don't know if I connected as much with this, but maybe it helps to think about it in terms of a timeline. The suggestion is to, on the other piece of paper, just draw yourself a timeline, right? And the beginning is your birth, and you can put that date on there if you remember it, and then all the way up to present day, and then divide it between like positive and negative. Now, one reason I don't like this necessarily is because not every major life turn is all positive or all negative, right? And I think this kind of limits it a little bit. But the suggestion is make yourself a timeline, just real quick line, put some markers in there, and take the pictures or words or phrases that you have written down, or just doing this in your mind is fine, of your major story turns, and where do they go on the timeline, both in terms of when and in terms of whether they were positive or negative. And you could even maybe treat the page as a spectrum. You know, the higher you put it, the more positive it is, the lower you put it, the more negative it is. And if it's right on the line, it's a mixture of both. Now, if I'm not interrupting you, just as a curiosity here, whether you're doing this on paper or in your head, how is your timeline shaping up in terms of is there a place on the chronological path of your timeline that things are concentrated, or are they all spread out? And how are they falling in terms of positive and negative? So you don't have to tell any specific stories if you don't want to, but just where are things falling on your timeline?
For me, they're speeding up. Like more things are happening right now.
Okay. Okay, concentrated recently.
You were going to say.
Well, just that things seem to be going along positively until we started dealing with the son and his addictions. And then things went downhill for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
And then they came back up again. And then, there's been ups and downs, but, that was a big down for a long time.
Right. Yeah. And that the way you said that, Linda, made me wonder, if you did this on paper and you tried to map out your positives and negatives and how positive and negative they were, what kind of mountain range are you drawing?
Yeah, that was a long trough.
That was a long trough. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I unmuted myself. So if that's not good, let me know, because the next door neighbor is mowing his lawn in the dark. You probably can hear the background noise. I just now turned because I want to talk to you, but if it gets too noisy, let me know.
No,
but
I can hear you just fine.
Hey, I find that a lot of the negatives were kind of up and down, because I had wonderful summers, but a very unhappy childhood. But we would escape to Oregon every summer. So every year there was a little upswing. And one of the most difficult things for me was moving to Delaware from Michigan and leaving behind the Midwest where I spent my whole life. But now what was a negative, that move was one of the most difficult things, has now become the most positive thing. If I would have stayed in Michigan, I wouldn't be having the life I have now. And so I think that's interesting, that some things sometimes in our lives that we think are really negative, as we look back, we realize they were for a purpose, and that they brought us to a place that we would never be today without having to go through that time. Does that make any sense? Like if I was still in Michigan, I wouldn't be at Calvary. There's just one example, but so many things in my life have changed because I live out here now, where I thought I wanted to stay back there. So what was the biggest negative, one of the biggest negatives, has turned into one of the greatest positives instead, but I didn't know that at the time.
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense. Thank you, Melanie.
Yeah.
And get back to me later on how they mow grass in the dark. I want to know that.
It is dark here. I don't know how he's doing that, but
Can you, Corey, can you go back to that previous questions?
That one?
Yeah. kind of interesting there. Number 5, my first real job, and I'm kind of unique in this, was also my last real job.
Okay.
You know, my first real job was teaching at St. Mark's. And, you know, I'm unique in that I spent my entire career there. You know, sure, I worked at Dairy Queen and those things like that, Paperboy and stuff like that beforehand, but, you know, the real job. The other one there, what was that question? Your first love there, where did I see that somewhere in there?
Yeah,
6.
first of 6, yeah.
Yeah, okay. My first real love is sitting right next to me. So that's
He just, when he finds a good thing, he sticks with it, you see.
Right, yeah. You stick with the good jobs and the good people. Okay.
and as Linda says, our biggest accomplishment is
We stayed married all this time.
I like it. Big accomplishment. For for those of you who can't see it on your devices necessarily, as you're telling your stories, Jenna's giving you a lot of emoji hearts, Zoom reaction hearts. Okay, so I think I have to wrap it up there, but I do just want to very quickly tell you and show you like why did I just have you do that? What does that have to do with mission and Bible study and mission in the Gospels? Because what we're going to get into next is just how multifaceted, their phrase, the gospel story is, and our faith journey is, and how the same kinds of ups and downs and clusters and confusing points and long valleys and all this stuff. It's the gospel stories and people's lives when they encountered Jesus, and all of this were just as complex and sometimes unpredictable. And so they say here, discovering multifacets of the gospel in the lives of people who encounter Jesus. How and when do people perceive the gospel as good news? As the circumstances change in people's lives, different facets of the good news become apparent to people in the ways they may not have noticed before. A change in environment or a change in life circumstances often results in altering our perspectives of what is gospel or what is good news for us. And so what we're going to end up doing next time is we're going to start with this verse from Ephesians. They point out some interesting things in this verse, and then we're going to look at some stories, some encounters with Jesus, and how what ends up being the message, the good news, how Jesus ends up encountering and communicating with these people at the moment in which they encounter each other, and what this teaches us about mission and the gospel, and how we see our role as the church as storytellers and sharers and journeyers and all of that. So that's kind of where that's going. I think the idea was to start thinking a little bit about your story and your timeline and where things fall and how things go into mountains and valleys and twists and turns. And then just kind of have that as our context and lens for how we encounter the people in the Gospels that Jesus met, and why it went the way that it did. So that's the idea. That's next week.